Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the history of the modern global debt system, a system that, as we'll see, might have been designed so that escape is nearly impossible.
Let's just start with a number that's, well, it's pretty mind-boggling. Global debt has now shot past $315 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's more than 3 times the size of the entire global economy. Think about that. Every major country on Earth is deep in debt.
And that brings us to a really central and honestly kind of strange paradox. If every single nation owes money, who exactly is everyone in debt to? I mean, who is the ultimate creditor holding all the cards?
Well, the answer isn't some single person or entity, but a system. A system that was built piece by piece over 3 centuries by 4 key figures. So in this explainer, we're going to walk through each one to see exactly how this trap was set. Okay, let's kick things off with our first architect, a man named William Paterson. Now before him, debt was a pretty simple affair. You either paid it back or you defaulted. Paterson, he was about to change the very nature of government debt forever.
So, picture this. The year is 1694. England is flat broke and absolutely desperate for money to fund a war against France. Traditional lenders, they're spooked because the king has a bad habit of defaulting. And right into this crisis steps Paterson with a truly revolutionary proposal.
His innovation was simple, but it was absolutely profound. He suggested a loan to the government that would never be paid back. Seriously, instead, the government would just pay interest on it, forever. And that payment would be guaranteed by the government's ultimate power, the power to tax its own citizens.
And this is just a brilliant illustration of how the first layer of the trap worked. You've got wealthy merchants lending their money, and in return they get a permanent, never-ending stream of income, all paid for by taxpayers. The government gets some money it needs for its war, and the debt itself, in the form of banknotes, actually becomes a new kind of currency. The first piece of the puzzle was in place.
All right, so let's move to our next architect and see how this thing starts to grow. Paterson made national debt permanent, but it was Nathan Rothschild who would grab this concept and make it truly global.
So, during the Napoleonic Wars, Rothschild didn't just lend money to governments, he turned the whole thing into an industry. He would buy up massive amounts of government bonds, which is just a fancy word for debt, and then he'd resell them to investors all across Europe. This created the very first international market for national debt.
So, what's the crucial point here? This made defaulting on your national debt almost impossible. It wasn't just about cheating 1 or 2 wealthy lenders anymore. Now, it was about threatening a very complex, very interconnected global system.
And what's really fascinating about this is who now owned a country's debt. A British bond might be held by a French investor, used as collateral by a German bank, and owned by an Austrian aristocrat's pension fund. You see the problem? If you default now, you threaten to bring down the entire international financial system. The web was woven and it was unbreakable.
Okay, so now the system is permanent and it's global, but it still had one natural limit. Lenders could actually run out of money to lend. Our third architect, J.P. Morgan, would engineer a solution to make the creation of debt truly, absolutely infinite.
After the panic of 1907, which, by the way, Morgan himself had to personally bail the country out of, he knew a more permanent solution was needed. So, in 1910, he and the nation's most powerful bankers met in total secret on a place called Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. Their mission? To design a central bank for America. And in 1913, their plan became law as the Federal Reserve Act.
And right here, this is the core of Morgan's innovation. The Federal Reserve was given the incredible power to literally create money out of thin air to buy government bonds. This created a guaranteed infinite buyer for U.S. debt. The government can now borrow limitlessly because the Fed could always just print the money to buy the bonds. The engine for infinite debt was finally built.
So, fast forward to the 1970s, and the system is pretty much mature. But a new problem starts to emerge. Developing nations, who had borrowed a ton of money in dollars, were starting to buckle under the weight of their payments. And that brings us to our final architect, Fed Chair Paul Volcker, who would make the trap truly inescapable for them.
To fight runaway inflation back in the U.S., Volcker did something almost unthinkable. He hiked interest rates to an unprecedented 20%. Now, this did crush inflation at home, but it absolutely crippled developing nations who had taken out those cheap dollar-based loans. All of a sudden, their payments went through the roof. And in 1982, Mexico announced it was about to default, a move that would have vaporized major American banks.
But instead of letting Mexico default and the banks fail, Volcker orchestrated a brand new solution through the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And this comparison is key. The old system, where you could just default, was replaced with a new system of permanent management.
They were called structural adjustment loans. Basically, the IMF would lend a country just enough new money to continue making the interest payments to its old creditors. But in exchange, that country had to hand over control of its economic policy. We're talking privatizing state-owned companies, cutting public services, opening up their markets. The debt was never forgiven. It was just refinanced into a kind of perpetual servitude.
So, let's put all the pieces together. How do the innovations of these four men, Patterson, Rothschild, Morgan, and Volcker, combine to create the complete architecture of this modern debt trap?
Each architect solved a problem for the system, adding a crucial new layer. Patterson made the debt permanent. Rothschild made it interconnected, basically too big to fail. Morgan made its creation infinite. And then finally, Volcker made it inescapable, even for countries that had no way to pay.
This all leads us to a really crucial understanding. This isn't just some abstract economic theory. It is a very real machine, designed for the transfer of wealth on a global scale. The only question is, from whom to whom?
And this table just illustrates the flow perfectly. The money starts with taxpayers, the citizens of every country. It flows to their governments through taxes, which then pay it out as interest, often called debt service, to the bondholders. And who are the bondholders? They're the people and institutions like banks, pension funds, and asset managers that own all that government debt.
And the scale of this wealth transfer is almost impossible to wrap your head around. The United States government, by itself, now pays about $1 trillion per year just in interest. That is $1 trillion transferred from the public to the holders of capital every single year.
Which leaves us with a final and pretty provocative thought. Maybe this $315 trillion in global debt isn't a crisis, or a mistake, or some problem that we need to fix. Maybe, just maybe, it's the intended result of a system built, piece by these four architects, to work exactly as it does today.